If you don't get product market fit, your company is just going to die. That's okay. And then you move on. You don't like try to come up with a plan B of how do we try to just squeeze out as much runway as possible. Test the thing that you're going to test, do it the best that you can, try to win. If your company fails, it's not the end of the world.
On this episode of the Liberty Ventures podcast, I'm so excited to be talking with Sam Corcos, an old friend who's now the co-founder and CEO of Levels Health, a wearable healthcare company that gives people insights to their metabolic health to lead better lives. That has been valued at over $300 million, has incredible backers like Andreessen Horowitz, and is loved by its customers so much that they opened up a crowdfunding raise where their customers can become investors in the company as well. Would it be accurate to call you a serial entrepreneur? I know that over your entire life, you've basically been entrepreneurial and you've been involved in a lot of startups, but would you classify yourself as a serial entrepreneur?
I don't know if I would. It's more like I would say I more have a problem with authority, and I would not make for a very good employee. So I think it's more out of necessity that I've ended up largely doing my own businesses and doing a lot of consulting. But maybe by the strict definition of the term, that might be accurate.
I want to talk about some of your entrepreneurial work before getting into Levels, and would love to actually just have you kind of explain your thought process in entering the business space and starting all the companies that you have that's led to you building up Levels now.
Levels was my fourth go at it. The first couple were bootstrapped companies in fairly small markets that saw some traction. I think the first company did maybe 60 or 80,000 in revenue in the first year, but didn't really have a good trajectory after that. So we wound that down. It's really just been trying to find areas where I can add value, and it's always all of these companies have been in software. That's my background is as a software developer. I spent a lot of time doing software consulting and doing the whole. I think what is now called being a digital nomad. I don't think that was a widely accepted term back when I was bouncing around doing software development. But I think once I realized that my only real limitation is I have to be somewhere that has internet, which turns out to be everywhere. That it was a lot of fun. So each of these projects has been something that seemed like a really big opportunity, and it's always been software related.
And I travel a lot. I led the digital nomad life, but not to the extent that you did. If I recall correctly, you fit everything into a backpack that you carried with you, and you literally just kept traveling with that during that phase of your life.
I did a presentation for our team on minimum viable stuff, and the amount of stuff that you need is actually a lot less than you'd anticipate. Yeah, I actually have the backpack right here. I have the same one, and it's not that much stuff. We have a baby now, so we have to travel with a lot more stuff. In fact, we were just joking about how we went from I had a backpack, my wife would have a carry-on, and now it's like 4 check bags, and it's like we got to bring our whole world with us everywhere we go now. So it's a different phase for sure.
We don't have time for the whole presentation, but if you were to condense the minimum viable stuff that you needed, that people need, or that you found you needed, what would that condense into?
A couple of the principles maybe that would be useful is there are a lot of assumptions that people have on things that they need. Like some people think you can't wear a pair of pants more than once. You have to wash them every time you use them. Turns out that's not true. Like there's a lot of assumptions about the way that we do things that are just not accurate. Like I have one pair of pants, which means that I wear them quite a number of times before they get washed. And you know what? It's never been an issue. Jeans just work fine that way. Most of my shirts are like really breathable. I probably wear them 3 or 4 days between washes, and it's never been an issue. So I think another principle would be you don't have to bring your whole life with you. I remember there was one backpacking trip that I went on with a friend of mine from college, and I brought a small backpack. He brought his entire life with him. And he was like, well, what if it rains? Like, you don't have an umbrella. It's like, well, they sell umbrellas in China. It's like, they do that here. It's like, well, what if you need to do laundry? It's like, people do laundry in China. It's like all of the things that you do normally, they do them in these other places too. And so if you need to do it, you can just get it there. You don't need You don't need to plan for every possible contingency, because you'd be surprised how rarely those things actually happen. So I think those are maybe some of the, it's, I would say making fewer assumptions about how you have to do things, and also not planning for every possible contingency, and just be willing to go with the flow as things change.
I feel like there's a business lesson in there as well. Have you brought that into building up your previous startups and levels now?
I think one of the biggest ones for maybe one of the biggest ones for levels is around. I found that many people they strategize around worst case scenario. It's like, if this thing goes wrong, and if that thing goes wrong, and if this fails, and if that fails, how do we hedge against that? And I think really understanding what risk, why is it that you're hedging for that risk, and what risks are worth hedging is really important. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine who's running a startup, and he was like, well, if we don't get product market fit, then we need to do X, Y, and Z. Like, we need to hedge against it. It's like, if you don't get product market fit, your company is just going to die. So, like, that's okay. And then you move on. You don't like try to come up with a plan B of like, how do we go cockroach mode forever, and like try to just squeeze out as much runway as possible. It's like, test the thing that you're going to test, do it the best that you can, like try to win. If your company fails, it's not the end of the world. And so understanding what risks that you're taking, what exposure you have, and then hedging for the things that are important to hedge against. But you don't need to hedge against everything. Like, especially when you're in a startup, there's a lot of risk that you expose yourself to. Like, to bring it back to the travel thing, it's like, you don't need to hedge for whether it rains. It's actually, if it rains, worst case scenario, you just get a little bit wet. It's not the worst thing. Or you spend $5 on an umbrella. Is it worth all of the extra overhead of planning for every possible contingency? Usually not.
It almost reminds me of Reid Hoffman's mantra that in a startup, you have a lot of fires and you have to let some fires burn. You have to know which ones you really ought to tackle and which ones you just let go for a while.
Oh yeah, I mean, you let most fires burn, and it's really, really uncomfortable for people. Like, you see the list of bugs in your backlog, and you're like, we have to solve all of these, and the answer is you actually don't. In fact, you only need to solve a very small percentage of them for it to work.
Okay. Now, to get into levels, between your third startup and getting into levels, you took a lot of time off in between. And I think the process you went through in deciding to enter levels, which is in a different industry than anything you had done before, dealing with health for individuals, is kind of crazy to a certain extent since it wasn't your background. I'd love it if you could share what that journey was like for you and how you decided to enter the space.
Yeah, so I took about a year off after my last company. Um, it is interesting that it feels very different from the outside. Like, the first company was in construction software. The second company was in topographical mapping software for the U.S. military. The third company was in car repair software, and the current company is in healthcare software. But under the hood, they're mostly the same. Like, software in in the consumer space is really not that different between all these different applications. It's marginally different. Who you sell to, the market dynamics, the go-to-market strategy are very different, but the actual underpinnings of the technology end up being a lot more similar than one might expect. I I had this realization during that time off that I took, that a lot of the things that I ended up doing, whether they are the companies that I started or the projects that I took on as a consultant, um, they kind of happened randomly. And it was like, I had this realization that I was the passenger and not the driver of a lot of the things that were happening in my life. They would just sort of happen to me, and I would say, wow, that sounds cool. Sure, I'll do that. But I wasn't making a proactive decision on, but what do I actually want to do with my time? So that was really, that was a real motivator and recognition that I need to be more intentional with how I spend my time. And I think it's actually a normal thing to go through in one's life, where in your teens and your 20s, you should just say yes to everything, and you should just work really hard, because you're doing so much exploration. You have no idea what good even looks like. So you should just do as much as you can. And then there's a certain point in your life, which maybe you experienced this as well, where saying no is actually a smarter default than saying yes. because there were so many things to do that you could just find yourself completely overwhelmed with how many opportunities there are, and you won't get anything done that actually matters. So that was really where I found myself in my early 30s. It's like, I need to say no to more things. I need to think more carefully about what I want to do. So I narrowed down what I wanted to spend my time on to a handful of verticals that I thought were really important. Healthcare being one of them. It's a very large industry that impacts many people in often a very negative way. And so I spent some time exploring a lot of different ideas, and one of those ideas ended up being the company that became Levels.
And during that year off, I know that you got a lot of offers from other people to join their teams or work on other startups. And you very intentionally said you would not say yes to anything to your next venture for a year to give you the space to really explore those different possibilities and be intentional about what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I gave myself a minimum of 6 months. That was my goal. Was I set a lower bound, like no matter what comes up, I'm gonna say no for 6 months, and that ended up being really important because I there were so many things that came up that seemed really interesting in the moment, but like one specific example, a couple weeks in, there was somebody who was starting a fintech company and offered me a technical co-founder role at this fintech company, and the market seemed really big, the numbers seemed really good, and I told him like, this sounds really cool, but I promised I wouldn't commit to anything for 6 months. So I said no, but if this is still a thing in 6 months, we'll talk. And then a few weeks went by, and it was like, did I almost become a co-founder of a fintech company? I hate fintech. How did I almost end up spending the next decade of my life in an industry that I don't even like? And it's because, there's so many shiny objects and they all seem so interesting, and you just want to jump into each one. And then as months went by and so many more of those opportunities came up, I just realized like, man, the world is awash in opportunity. There's so many things that I could be spending my time on. I had to be much more intentional about it.
And okay, now let's talk about Levels, which you decided that you wanted to throw yourself into, which is a healthcare company creating wearables for people to be able to track their health in real time in really interesting ways that you keep iterating on. What was it about that opportunity that really spoke to you?
So one is just how important the metabolic health crisis is in the United States. I think as I started digging into the research on this, I really underestimated how bad this problem is. The fact that there are 90 million Americans who are pre-diabetic right now, and the CDC estimates that as many as 70% of those people will be diabetic within 10 years. This is a problem that type 2 diabetes used to be a fairly rare condition of aging, and now we see it in children. We see 5-year-olds with what used to be called adult onset diabetes because wasn't even contemplated that children could get this. So uh, realizing just how much of a problem this is, like you can use obesity as a proxy for this because it is one of the symptoms of underlying metabolic dysfunction. Whereas in Japan, the obesity rate is 4%, and in America, it's 40%. Like the numbers are really hard to understand and just how much of a problem. I think the study most recently out of University of North Carolina shows that 89% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. They show some of these symptoms of metabolic syndrome. Uh, that's really scary. It's also not random. Like when I know very few people who have type 2 diabetes. And you talk to certain people in certain communities, every person they know has diabetes. This is not a random distribution. And so realizing that I had very little exposure to this and just the scope of this problem was a big motivator of realizing that somebody needs to solve this problem. I think the other was, there's another famous line from Justin Kahn, which is first-time founders think about product, second-time founders think about distribution, which I strongly resonate with because it's really easy to build product, especially when you're a software developer. It's so much fun to build stuff. You ship it, you're building, you're learning. But if nobody buys it, ultimately there was really no point in building it at all. And buying it means distribution. So often a distribution first strategy is where you need to focus. And so I started tinkering with this idea with Josh, who ended up becoming my co-founder with Levels. And the early indications were really strong. In fact, we were able to, I told Josh that I'm not going to do this unless we can sell it. So I think in our first month of operation, I think we sold about $5,000 worth of products. And that was a really good sign early on, because if you solve a big enough problem, people will give you money for it. And so I think showing that traction early was something that was really important. And it's also where a lot of people get stuck, is they stay in this like pre-revenue phase for way too long. And they never actually validate that people want their product to begin with. And they spend years spinning their wheels, building a theoretical product. But really, you need that empirical validation, which is people giving you money for the thing that you're buying.
What a great insight already, that first time founders think about product, but it's more important to think about distribution. And you're going after a really big market here. But let's talk about the way that you've structured Levels and the culture in the company, because I think there's an interesting analogy between the product you're creating, which is giving people more transparency and insights to their own physical health, and the level of transparency and openness that you've brought into Levels regarding the team and the way you set this up, with everything from you actually record and make your team meetings public, or so that people are able to see what you're doing, and have done a number of other things with that. Why did you set it up this way? That's which seems antithetical to the way most businesses are structured.
Yeah, I mean, it's not obvious that it's a good idea, but it is definitely an experiment that we're running. Um, all of our investor updates from day one of the business are public on our website. You go to our website, you go to the footer, and you can see all of our investor updates. We delay them by a year just because we don't, any sort of like pending contracts, we don't want to interfere with that. But all of that information is public. All of our team, all hands, our Friday forums are also public on our website. So you can see all of our weekly team meetings. There's definitely a lot of this is, many people mention how the culture of a company is often a reflection of the CEO's personality. I think there's a lot of truth to that, which is I really only want to work in a business where I trust the people that I work with, where there's a degree of transparency and trust and openness that everyone defaults and agrees to live by. And so it's really, in some ways, it's a forcing function of attracting a certain type of person who wants a certain type of culture that's very high trust. I will say one of the, maybe I was going to say unintended benefits, but it really is intended in a lot of ways, is every person that we hire is more values aligned than the person before them, because there is so much information on the internet that I remember in the early days, this was been 2 or 3 years ago, we were hiring for a general counsel role for a lawyer. And when we would tell them about these things, it was like they had a brain aneurysm, like completely unfathomable to them that a company would operate in this way. And it was really challenging to get buy-in from people. But what's interesting is this last time around, we did another cycle of interviews for a similar role. And everyone who made it past the first filter of like bothering to apply knew enough about the business to know that that was the thing they were already looking for. And so it really, having all of this information out there, public and transparent, really creates this flywheel effect where you get more people like that who share similar values, who you can work with and you can trust, and you can deliver quality products more quickly.
So that makes sense for recruiting team members, but are you also thinking about your customers with this, for them to be able to see what you're talking about in these all hands meetings and the development of the business itself?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a subtle effect, but it requires a lot of trust to buy a product from a company that you stick into your body that pulls your own biological data out of you. Like you wouldn't want to do that to a company where you don't trust how they're going to use the data and you don't trust the people behind it. So there is definitely a degree where that transparency really helps to build that trusting relationship between a customer and the business, where they can see who the people are, they know that we're being honest, they can see what it is that we're doing. Um, so definitely that level of transparency, I think, helps a lot with the way that customers interact with us.
And to take it even a step further, in terms of your funding, you've been backed by some incredible VCs and individual investors. Andreessen Horowitz is a big investor, but you also just did a big public crowdfunding round on WeFunder, which gave the opportunity for other people, including your customers, to invest in you guys. A very different route than what a lot of other companies take, especially with the kind of backing that you've got. Why'd you decide to do that?
Yeah, it was really tactically. We had a lot of customers ask if they could put money in, and so we created that just as a vehicle to allow them to do it. I think for consumer products, when you have as much customer love as we have seen from the people who have used our product, it's a really great way to get that buy-in and to give them some exposure to the growth of the business. It's not it's a bad strategy for, say, B2B SaaS, where you're raising money. If you're doing it with the goal of raising money, it's probably not a good strategy. If you're doing it as a way to get, as a in addition to a fundraise, to allow your customers to get exposure on the same terms that the VCs are getting, I think it's a really good strategy for consumer, because it's hard to measure that level of buy-in and engagement that you get from it, but it's really valuable for consumer products.
It does seem like it makes it much stickier for them because they're not only bought into the product, they're bought into the whole company and want you to succeed at that level.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's actually go back to when you were first getting this started and attracting customers, given your point that it requires a high level of trust for people to insert things into their body or have it connect to their body to give them information. How did you go about introducing this in the first place and then building that trust with customers?
So I think there's no shortcut to just talking to customers. I think that's where a lot of, especially first-time founders, really get lost in the weeds of building a company. There's that, the midwit meme. There's like, on the left is the dumb person, in the middle is where everyone is, and on the right is the Jedi. You've probably seen this, but on either end, the simplest thing you can do is talk to customers. And where most people get stuck is they're like, A/B testing, performance marketing, this, that, scalability. It's like, or just maybe also just talk to customers. That's actually just the correct answer, is just talk to more customers. And learning who they are, what problems they have, what problems you can solve that they experience. There's no shortcut to that. I think in the first year, we kept track of how many customers our team talked to. I think I personally interviewed about 600 people. Mike D on our team, who was our first full-time hire, his full-time job for at least the first year, maybe the first 2 years, was just talk to customers. He probably talked to thousands of customers and just talk to them. No, yeah, no surveying. Surveying is in the middle of that meme. Just talk to them, get them on the phone, learn who they are, understand their problems, see if that's something that you can help them with. It's like you learn. A common thing that we would see is the number of people, and I actually count myself in this before I started using a continuous glucose monitor. It's like, yeah, I'm getting into my 40s or 50s, and I'm just so tired in the middle of the day now, and I didn't used to be, and I don't know why. And what a lot of people discover, this is what I discovered, is that turns out my finger quotes healthy breakfast of oatmeal and orange juice was actually the source of basically all of my problems throughout the day. This like glucose spike followed by the postprandial glucose crash into hypoglycemia exactly corresponded to when I felt like I had to take a nap because I was just so tired because I'm just on this roller coaster all day. And eating something that's lower in carbs, something that has higher fat, something that's a little bit more stable, I just didn't have that problem anymore. And so learning what those problems are and trying to help people get to the other side of it is really important. And so If you solve a big enough problem, people will give you money for it. So we would talk to them. I would get them on a call, usually 15 to 30 minutes. And if this is something that they're interested in, I would send them a link and they would buy it. And like, you don't need to set up legal entities. You don't need to do all this like overhead. Have them send it to you on Venmo. Just validate that they are willing to pay money for this thing, and you can figure out the rest of it later. Like, the penalty for these things would be absolutely trivial by comparison to you not learning what you need to learn fast enough.
So it sounds like one of the biggest pieces of advice for entrepreneurs here is to go out and start selling to validate that they've got market fit. And to do that also by just actually talking with their customers to find out what they want to have solved and they're willing to pay for.
Yeah, absolutely. And you really need it. Like, even at our scale today, every person on our team, regardless of role, every engineer, everyone in support, every executive at the company needs to talk to a customer at least once a month. Just direct communication with a customer. Learn who they are, learn how they're experiencing the product, learn what their problems are. There's no shortcut to that. Once you're talking to people and you understand what's going on, forget all these surveys, forget all this quantitative stuff. Just at a minimum, you've got to be talking to customers. It's a common failure mode that I've seen in some of the first-time founders that I talk to, is I'll say, you've got to talk to customers. And they say, oh yeah, I do all the time. It's like, okay, cool. How many did you talk to this week? It's like, well, this week I've been busy with fundraising. Okay, how about last week? It's like, well, last week I was busy with this thing. Okay, how about in the last month? It's like, well, I've been busy. It's like, when is the last time you actually talked to a customer who uses your product one-on-one? It's like, I don't know, a year. It's like, that is not what it means to talk to customers. You really need to know who these people are, understand their problems. There's no way around that. You have to talk to them.
Now, how do you prioritize that and make sure that you and everyone else are talking with customers? Because there are so many different priorities, things people are trying to take care of. How do you manage your to-do list?
So I'd say those are two separate questions. For how we manage it for the team, we have an accountability schedule. Somebody goes through everyone's calendar and checks to see when is the last time they talked to a customer, and then they have a report. I think it's weekly, maybe monthly, on like, did everyone do the call that they need to do, and does everyone have one scheduled for within the next month? And so we have a process internally that one of our admins runs to just make sure that everyone is talking to customers. When we first implemented it, it was somewhat controversial and there was some pushback. But then as soon as people started getting in the flow, it hasn't really been an issue. People see the value when you talk to customers. And so it was especially challenging for engineers to get buy-in. But as soon as I started talking to customers and they would see like an engineer who built a feature, and then somebody spontaneously was like, oh my God, I love this feature so much. It's like, whoa, that's really validating. They don't even know that I built that thing, but like, they're giving me feedback on how much they loved it. That's really cool. Or they're giving me feedback like, I'm really confused by how this thing works. They're like, oh wow, that's really interesting. I'm going to fix that right now. It's like, while we're on this call, I'm going to fix that problem and we're going to ship a new build. So there's no shortcut to that. I think in terms of how I manage my time, I found that you have to use the constraint of your capacity, which is time. So I just use my calendar to manage my time. Um, I was actually on a call with somebody on our team just like within the last 2 hours, trying to explain to them why capacity planning is so important. When you have an empty calendar, it feels like you can do an infinite amount of stuff within that time. Saying like, oh yeah, I'll have it to you by the end of the week. You can say that for an unlimited number of things, and you can theoretically get it done. But as soon as you put those blocks on the calendar, it's like, okay, well, how long will that thing take? It'll take 6 hours. Great. Let's block off 6 hours on Thursday. How long will this thing take? 12 hours. Great. Let's block off 6 hours here, 6 hours there. It's like, well, suddenly you've blocked off more time than there are hours in the week, which means that you've overbooked yourself, which means you need to have some conversations to reorganize your schedule to make sure that things get done. So I think maybe a controversial statement is that I think busy is a choice. Like, we all have the same amount of time. And so what you choose to do with it, it's only a prioritization question. It's like, I think people often ask, like, where do you find the time to do X? It's like, well, it's the same amount of time as everyone else. I just make it a priority. So there are other things that I don't do. Um, One of the things that I've taken a cue from Jensen Huang is an interesting guy from NVIDIA around how he does I think he has 60 direct reports, which seems crazy because of the way that the default assumption of how a direct report relationship should work in a tech company, which is your manager is your personal therapist. Your manager is your best friend. Your manager is all of these things. Your manager is your career counselor. Your manager is, I think if you set very clear expectations about what the role is, which is like, I'm here to win a championship. So our calls, these are not the time that we have blocked on the calendar, it's not an entitlement. It's there to make sure that I have capacity for solving problems that you have when they come up. But if there's nothing on the agenda, the meeting gets canceled. And so oftentimes 3/4 of my one-on-ones get canceled each week, and I have a lot of time to do the work that I need to do. And I think I have 20, 25 direct reports, and it works great because we've set very clear expectations around that. So I think in terms of how I prioritize things, how I manage time, it's really around understanding where you get value from and also energy, just what gets you excited to wake up in the morning and do a thing, and try to do as much of that as humanly possible and as little of the other stuff as you can.
Sam, this has been brilliant. But before we wrap up, is there anything we haven't covered that you think is worthwhile to share with other investors or entrepreneurs in the Liberty Ventures community?
I think maybe one that's just been on my mind recently is that I think people often spend too much time thinking about investor perception, which is to say they spend too much time thinking about how what should I focus on to make sure that investors see me favorably rather than building the best possible business. This ties actually into the revenue versus pre-revenue question, where it's like, well, as soon as we show any revenue, we're suddenly post-revenue, and then we're valued differently. It's like, yeah, but if you don't generate revenue, you have a bad business. So I, it is almost universally the case that any decision that I have seen made, which is like, well, we can't fire this really terrible person because investors might perceive that like it's too chaotic and like they want stability before they invest. So we'll fire them immediately after we raise. It's like, no, this person's a huge problem. Fire them yesterday and then move on. It is I I have maybe never seen a good decision made when concerns over investor perception was the main reason for making or not making a decision.
Just do what's best for the business, especially in actually growing the business.
Yeah, and the reality is like if if an investor cares about the stuff, if they care about these like tedious things and they don't care about the health of the business, you absolutely do not want to work with that person. Like no investor, the only investors that you want to work with are the ones who care about the health of the business and want to build something great together, not people who care about these like tedious marginal things. So quality investors understand that validation of product market fit is revenue. So you need to start generating that as quickly as possible. And if they start valuating you on like a revenue multiple when you're only doing $1,000 a month in revenue, you probably shouldn't work with that person because they're not sophisticated enough.
Sam, thank you for taking the time today. Thanks for everything that you're doing and keep up just being amazing and building an amazing company.
Thanks, Alex.